You know how this whole thing goes. Long-time reader, first-time poster. My name is James. I'm 20 years old, and this happened to me when I was 18. Before I start, though, I have to tell you some background. I used to go to a college in New Hampshire. I'm in no way an intimidating person by stature, and most of my friends aren't either, considering quite a lot of them are girls, so just keep that in mind. One night I was sitting in my dorm room, working on some homework that I needed to do for class the next day. About an hour and a half into doing homework, I got a call from one of my friends named Michaela. She asked if I wanted to smoke a blunt with her. I happily obliged, as I'm not one to usually turn down free smoke-ups. About 15 minutes passed by, and Michaela called and said she was waiting outside my dorm. I grabbed up my coat and keys and left immediately. I had a weird feeling when I left, though, because I usually travel with my knife, especially when I was in New Hampshire. There were a lot of sketchy meth heads in my college's town, but I shook the feeling off and just started thinking about how blazed I was going to get. At this point in college, I was a sophomore. Most of my friends didn't have apartments or houses, and we couldn't smoke on campus. This meant we used to go on a copious amount of L rides. Every L ride I've ever been on has been normal, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened, until this night. The route we usually took was a winding back road that creeps up a mountain with a thick layer of trees on either side. There were some houses as well. The road was very secluded and was entirely residential, so there was never much traffic. On our usual rides, we would drive up the road and over towards the dam that was about halfway up the mountain. But this ride, we decided we wanted to explore a bit. We drove up towards the dam but made a turn down a side road. This side road was eerie and quite creepy, and the fact that we went at night just made it all the more horrifying. There were no streetlights at all, and no lights on the houses either. This is when I started to get that bad feeling in my gut. As we were driving down the road, I kept looking behind us to see if anyone was following us, because I suddenly had a very strange feeling that someone was watching us. After about 5 minutes of driving on the paved road, it suddenly turned onto a dirt road. I had seen enough to immediately say we should turn back, and proceeded to say that the car we were in wasn't appropriate for this terrain. Everyone else in the car vetoed me, though, and we pressed on. We drove down the road for another 10 minutes or so, and I started to feel a little less anxious and paranoid, probably because of the weed we were smoking kicking in. My friend Kelsey was in the car as well. She was just about to hand me the blunt when I saw headlights coming towards us. I started to get that uneasy feeling again, but this time it was much more convincing. The hair on the back of my neck started to stand up, and my blood ran cold. As I hit the blunt, I watched the car inching closer and closer. No one else but me seemed to think this was weird. What happened next, though, made me thankful I'd read so many encounter stories on here. The car was about 50 feet from us now, and it started to slow down. I could see that it was an old Ford, probably made in the late 80s. It was disgustingly dirty, covered all over in mud, grime, and rust. The closer the truck got to us, the more that feeling of nervousness grew. The truck was only about 10 feet from us when it stopped in the middle of the road, completely blocking us off. The fact that we were on a dirt road made this so much worse. There was no curb or sidewalk to drive on, and no shoulder for us to pull off to. The truck just sat in front of us for about 2 minutes, when a tall, bearded man hopped out. He looked disgusting. His clothes were covered in dirt and what looked to be blood. He was just standing there, staring at us with a terrifying, toothy grin, when I noticed he had something in his right hand. I couldn't see what it was because his car door blocked the view, but I'm 100% sure it was a knife. I started yelling at my friend who was driving to get the fuck out of there. I've read too many stories on here to become a victim of this bullshit. At this point, I was the only one calm enough in the car to see through all my options. I saw that there was a little clearing on our right that the car could just barely squeeze through. I told my friend to gun it. She threw it in reverse and beamed it to the right. All the while the man just stared and smiled. Then, As we passed by, he made a gun with his hand and pretended to shoot the car, then proceeded to laugh a horribly terrifying laugh. We were flying down this dirt road, trying to get away from the man, but as we turned down a side road that would take us back to the main one, I realized the truck had started following us. I told my friend to drive towards campus. We were only about 15 minutes or so from it. The truck followed us all the way back to campus, and at one point, came up right next to us at a red light. The man made the same gesture with his hand, and laughed the same laugh as before. I rolled down my window, and yelled at him that he was a psycho. I told him I'd call the cops if he didn't stop, but the next thing he said chilled me to my core. Just before the light turned green, he said, "It's okay, James. The police don't know where I live or who I am after all." My mouth dropped. How the fuck did this man know my name? When I got dropped off, I looked to see if the truck was still around, but I couldn't find it anywhere. I wish the story ended here, but unfortunately, there's one more terrifying part. A couple of days after that incident, I woke up to go to my 10 a.m. class. Usually the first thing I do when I wake up is open my blinds, look outside, and see what the world has in store for me that day. As I looked outside today, though, I could see that same truck parked in the parking down the street from my dorm. I knew it was the same one because it had the exact same big rust spot on the hood. At first, I wasn't so nervous about this. I was at school with 5,000 other people, and there was no way he could do anything to me on campus during the day. By the way, the school I went to is quite small, and only takes about 6 minutes to walk from one end of the campus to the other. I forgot all about it, got dressed, and headed off to class. As I was heading out of my dorm, though, a friend of mine who was walking the dorm said someone had paid her $5 to come and give me a letter. A man had told her I needed it urgently and to bring it immediately to my room. I reluctantly took the note, said thanks, and walked on to class. I opened the note once I sat down. "Hello, James. Remember me?" "Of course you do. You invaded my personal space by coming on that road, you know. I don't take kindly to that. I must return the favor. So, see you soon. G." I walked out of class instantly, went right to the parking lot looking for the truck, but it was gone. This note made me quite uneasy over the next few weeks. I went out less and less, and eventually wouldn't leave my dorm room except for class. I finally decided to tell my parents about 6 weeks after the note incident, but since then, nothing happened. I figured it was over, and the man had forgotten about me, so I told my parents everything had gone back to normal. Until one morning. Usually my friend Kelsey would wake me up at around 9, and we would go get breakfast together. But this morning, I was awoken by someone tossing something at my window. I looked at my phone before I looked out, and saw it was only 5 a.m. in the morning. What asshole was throwing shit at my window at 5? Sure enough, I looked out, and that man was standing there with that same grin. My heart sank. I opened the window and yelled out, "What the fuck are you doing here?" "I'm here for you. Your time has come." "What the fuck are you talking about, you moron?" I said. He didn't like this response very much. He stared at me with this hungry look as he said, "You're coming with me, whether it be today, tomorrow, or a week from now. It'll be your turn eventually, James." I was more angry than I was scared at this point. I just wanted this asshole to leave me alone. "Okay, well, I'm calling the police now, so you better leave." The man got this blank look in his eye. "Don't press your luck, boy. Next time I see you walking from a party alone, I won't be as friendly." I stood there in shock as I watched the man walk down the street and disappear in the distance. I remembered that one of the first weeks I had gotten to school, I was walking home drunk and alone from a party, as I often tend to do. A car pulled up next to me and asked if I needed a ride or any directions. I politely said no thank you, and the driver obliged. It finally hit me. The man that had asked me if I needed a ride was the same man that was just outside my window. I got chills throughout my spine. The man had stalked me and watched my every move from that interaction on. I believe if I had taken that ride offer, I would have never been seen again. After figuring this out, I told my parents the next day, and they pulled me out of the school. I live back in my hometown now, but I still get nervous that the man will come find me down here. I'm coping with it the best I can, and trying to get over it. The only thing that still haunts me relentlessly is I have no idea how this man had been watching me for so long. It makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. To give some explanation and background knowledge for this whole encounter, I was around 15 at the time this occurred. I was camping out in the middle of nowhere with my family, and part of my extended family as well. My aunt, uncle, and cousins were with us. I was the oldest kid there in the RV though, so you can probably understand how it felt to have no one else to do the stupid crap I did back then with. With a good 2-year gap between me and the inferiors, it was almost like nirvana when I got to the campground and met with the other teenagers. These were all people we knew fairly well from previous camping trips, so it was considered normal to hit it off with them from the start and act like we'd known each other forever well within the hour. Now that that's all laid out, on to the story. My parents trusted me a lot, not a lie. I liked my fun, but I liked getting home in time for dinner equally as much. So, when I was gone most of the day with other people from the camp, they never really thought too much of it. The only rule was that I had to be back at the RV to eat dinner, and before 8:30, 20:30 in the evening. So, picture this. A group of 6 teenagers, 15 to 16, out in the middle of the woods with no adult supervision for the vast majority of the day. Just a recipe for success right there. This particular day, though, we found a neat little deer trail we hadn't found in the 2 years we'd been there before. On second thought, though, it didn't really seem like a deer trail. It snaked through a really thick part of the underbrush, maybe a foot of clear ground, 3.5 feet of clear branches going upwards. It's a really hard thing to pick out of the brush, unless you're either really looking or know exactly where it is beforehand. It was promptly explored, marked with a broken branch right outside the entrance, and very quickly forgotten as well. Except, I remembered this special little tunnel. That night, while we were all eating dinner, one of the adults proposed we play manhunt out in the woods at night. Not everyone was totally on board with this idea, but in the grand scheme of the plan, they were quashed down like autumn leaves. Everyone grabbed a flashlight, and everyone was assigned a team. For those of you who aren't sure what manhunt is, here's a quick explanation. Everyone playing is given a flashlight, and we're all divided into 2 groups. It's basically like glorified flashlight tag, but there's a catch. As you catch people, you have to correctly identify who they are, and if you can, they join forces with the hunters. The last man standing gets a candy bar or something, whatever is being offered for a prize that game. This is how we played it, anyways. For the first round, I got lumped in with the runners, those who are being chased by the hunters. We get a 5-minute head start to run, climb a tree, whatever the hell we want to do to escape. Usually I'm the one up in the tree, but that's never really worked out as being a winning spot before. I decided this time to try and score a win for once. I decided to play the cat and use one surefire method of escape, and the hiding spot, of course, was the rude little path through the thicket. It took most of the head start time to find the damn thing, because it was so well hidden and out of the way. As I passed by hiding spots, I heard a hushed, smothered whispering between siblings who were questioning my actions. Like a bird's wings rustling when it's fluffing itself. It should be noted that I have bat-like hearing. My ears are probably my greatest asset in this game. But when I'm reaching the destination, I hear the short blast of the air horn announcing that the 5 minutes are up. I swan dove into this minute little path in the undergrowth, shuffling on my hands and knees until I was about halfway in, crouching down like some huge malformed quail. The hunters were doing an initial sweep through the trails, looking for obvious hiders and people caught out trying to change spots. When they finally reached my area, they reached the dead end and went straight back. I tried to readjust myself and crawl further down the tunnel. I honestly don't know how it happened, but I found an even more hidden path within that one. Accidentally, I dragged my stupid body down the rabbit hole, except instead of ending in a dead end, this one ended in a slight hollow. I don't want to ever describe exactly what I found there. I'm sorry, but I just can't. There was a younger looking woman, naked, covered in lacerations and stab wounds in the fetal position. Her glassy, glazed eyes seemed to look straight through me. I won't go any further than that. I was too scared to scream. I froze there while dark burgundy stains formed on my jeans. I froze there, in a pseudo-catatonic position, like a marble carving for what felt like hours. And then, I heard somebody else coming along the path. Have you ever been so scared that for one moment, one insane moment, you truly consider something incredibly stupid as a viable option to escape? And this was one of those times. I let out a short, trembling whimper and started to move. Whoever was on the path immediately stopped, and then started eagerly moving forward again. I could hear the panting, uneven breaths of a man, a horrible marker of whoever it was getting closer and closer to me by the second. By some wondrous miracle, though, he missed the path leading to the brushy hollow. I heard him moving down past the entrance, dragging something clunky and awkward behind him. I heard clinking noises, and the occasional effort to silence the small, sharp noises. I heard a low curse, somewhere towards the end of the tunnel. I blasted out of the undergrowth like a bullet, forcing its way out of a barrel. Cracks, crashes, and obnoxious rustling was all around me, and I heard the man sharply intake a breath and began to run towards me. The hoarse, deep panting was getting closer and closer, a testament to how slow I was at exiting. Somehow, though, I exploded out of the entrance, got onto my wobbly, half-asleep legs, and started booking it as fast as I could down the trail. The unknown pursuer was close behind me for a bit, but it seemed like he got too exhausted to chase me at the same speed for so long. I know everyone loves to rip on the fact that people always trip in horror movies, but in all honesty, tripping is something I'm amazed I didn't do. With so much adrenaline coursing through me at the speed of Usain Bolt, trying to make my jello, unsteady legs work to move me away, it was like trying to run on water. It felt like an eternity, but I finally reached the main trail running back to the camp and sprinted down it screaming bloody murder. Confused and concerned faces looked out from the trees, and I think someone called after me. Reaching the camp was easy, but trying to explain why I woke up half the people there and bolted out of the woods at breakneck speed was a lot harder. When I finally choked out the words to explain, I remember a profound, insidious silence throughout the group of adults waiting at the mouth of the trail. I don't really remember a lot from that point on. I know the cops were called, and my mother and aunt ran shrieking and wailing along the trail, calling for the other kids to come back to safety. When you hear someone yelling like that, you don't ignore it. They rounded up everyone in a 30-second time and barreled back to the camp. The police found the man out in the woods, creeping along the trail and clutching a knife. A black garbage bag with a plethora of sharp instruments and a saw was found abandoned on the trail, some speckled and smeared with dried blood. I don't think there's really any getting over it. I still have nightmares sometimes of the man chasing me, breathing heavily down the back of my neck and trying to catch me. Sometimes in my dreams, he succeeds. About once every 2 years, I get to visit my family around New Year's in New Jersey. My dad lives a block or so away from the beach, and while the town itself is quaint and mostly populated by retirees, there are some seedy parts across the train tracks. It was a cold night, around 40 degrees, and windy as hell. Bored at the house, I decided I would walk a few towns over to a bar I knew was open late. At the time I left the house, it was around 12 a.m., and instead of taking the boardwalk or the street, I decided to take a stroll along the beach. As I would find out, though, that was a very bad idea. The streetlights lit up about a quarter of the beach closest to the boardwalk, but as you walked further towards the ocean, there was almost no light. It became extremely hard to see any more than 20 feet in front of you. I was walking along the water's edge when I spotted a mound in the distance. It was located about halfway in between the beach and the boardwalk, so whatever it was wasn't very well illuminated. I didn't think much of it at first. I continued walking when I noticed some movement. Someone was hunched over the mound, and they clearly had a tool they were using to dig into the sand. I crouched low to the ground and walked closer and closer towards the ocean until my shoes were in the water. Adrenaline now pumping, I figured this was the best way to avoid being spotted. As I passed, I noticed the person digging wasn't using a flashlight either. I couldn't know for sure, but I felt like as I walked along the water, they stopped digging as if they'd noticed me. Walking faster along the water's edge, I waited until I had reached the next town over to cross the beach and quickly made my way to the main street. I decided to call it quits on the bar though and headed back home. Shaken, I tried to do some research after the fact to see if anything had turned up. The reason I'm writing this now is that I found an article about a buried body in that exact same location at that same time of year. The article states that the man was found buried in the dunes bordering the boardwalk and the beach, not in the beach itself. Regardless to say, the similarities are eerie. Before I start, here's a bit of context for my story. My husband and I lived in a small 2-floor house with 2 main entrances, one along the front and the other on the side of the house, which opens up directly into the laundry room. When we're too busy or it's too late to walk our dog, we hook his collar onto a long line that's attached to one of the pipes on the corner of our house so he can use the bathroom freely. We used to do this from the door in our laundry room, but we noticed the large step from the door to the ground had been taking a toll on his hips. As a result, we started letting him out through the front door instead, since the porch is much closer to the ground. This particular night, I was home alone with my dog. It was around midnight when I decided to let him outside one last time before going to bed. I hooked him up to his line, closed the door, and locked it before heading into the kitchen to put away the dishes. This was fairly routine. Even if he used the bathroom quickly, he liked to walk around along the front and sides of the house for a few minutes before walking back inside. As I'm putting away the dishes, I hear a scratch on the door. That's how my dog signals he wants to come back in, so I head over to let him back inside. Since I've watched way too many scary movies, I always look through the door's peephole before I ever open the door. Out of habit, I look to check that my dog is in front of the door. Instead, what I see is a man staring very intently at the door handle. I freeze with my hand on the handle. I don't know how much time went by, but then I heard another scratch, this one louder than the last. This kind of wakes me up from my initial shock, and I run to grab my cell phone. I call my husband to tell him what's happening. He was very confused. I probably wasn't explaining the situation very well, to be fair, but he said that he was heading home right away. This is when I realized that my dog was still outside with this person. I head back to the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible to check whether this stranger is still there. Just like before, he was standing there, head bowed and looking at the doorknob. I tiptoe over to the laundry room and slowly open the door as quietly as possible. I couldn't see my dog anywhere, and the side of my house is covered in gravel. I knew I couldn't take a step outside without making a ton of noise. With my heart still pounding in my chest, I go to the front door to keep an eye on the stranger and to get a better look at him. I considered calling the police, but I didn't feel they would take me seriously, since all this man was doing was standing menacingly in front of my house. I tried taking a picture of him with my cell phone, but my camera was only able to take pictures of the peephole and not get the image behind the glass. All of a sudden, the man looked directly up at me. I swear he knew I was there. He glared, and then opened his mouth to show this taunting, malicious grin. He stood there that way for a few moments. With that, he just suddenly turned around and walked down the street until he disappeared. I stood in the same place, almost expecting the man to rush back and start pounding on the door. Luckily, my husband got back after just a few minutes. Long story short, he convinced me to call the police, and we went out looking for our dog. It turns out the man had cut the end of the line connected to the pipe, and our dog decided this was a good time for him to explore my neighbor's backyard, which was where we found him. It's been 3 years since this happened. We've since moved to a new house for unrelated reasons, and the police weren't ever able to come up with any suspects. Ever since then, we take our dog on very long walks before the sun goes down. This story ended up being much longer than I had originally anticipated, so I apologize for the long read. I will say that in all the years I've told this story, people usually respond with, "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard," so I hope you enjoy it. This story occurred in the summer of 2008. I grew up in Oregon and was acquainted with the outdoors at an early age. My favorite hobby came to be hiking, particularly in areas that are either very dangerous or very isolated. The health benefits of hiking were secondary to the thrills of walking the edges of exposed cliffs, being in cougar and bear territory, and knowing that I was so far from help. Into the Wild was released in the fall of 2007, and I immediately fell in love. Being a high school senior, I could barely go another week living at my parents' house. The movie spoke to my sense of adventure and inspired me to hike the Californian portion of the Pacific Crest Trail upon graduation. I made it from the Mexico border to Northern California without much incident. I saw rattlesnakes, black bears, experienced dehydration, but nothing that happened made me fear for my life. Somewhere in the Lassen National Forest in northeastern California, I walked around a bend in the trail, only to be startled by 2 people sitting on a rock, dressed in nearly all white. Their faces were extremely dirty, their appearance disheveled, and the man had a long unkempt beard. Both seemed to be in their 40s. They looked like the couple who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. What struck me as odd about the encounter was encountering anybody at all. I frequently went days without seeing a single human being. Their white clothes could be explained away by the need to escape the California summer sun. Their scruffy appearance could be explained away by the fact that most thru-hikers abandoned personal hygiene on the trail. After I said hello, they said nothing, and simply stared at me as I passed by. Even that I didn't find odd. I chalked it up to them being foreign and not knowing what to say. I camped a few hundred yards off the trail that night, as I always did. Following bare precautions, I hung the leftover food I had cooked that night from a tree, approximately 5 feet off the ground. Packing up camp in the morning, I noticed the food wasn't there anymore. I immediately thought a bear had entered my campsite, and I began to look for paw prints. I didn't find any paw prints, but I did find boot prints circling the campsite, 2 pairs of them. One of those prints led right up to the rope from which the food had been hanging. I thought of the couple I had passed earlier, and everything quickly clicked. I packed up my things and left. My mind was racing the entire day, but I figured maybe they were simply hungry. If they had nefarious intentions, they would have come for more than the food. Several days passed by and nothing happened, so I began to be at ease again. I had begun to circle my campsite with sticks to wake me in the event of an intruder, animal or otherwise. I awoke in my tent one night to the sound of those sticks crunching. I grabbed my hunting knife right away. I tried to relax by telling myself that in the middle of nowhere, the source of that noise was much more likely an animal than a person. But then, I heard frantic whispering. It was impossible to tell which direction the voices were coming from. Being in the dark surrounded by trees, 100 miles from the nearest city, plays tricks on your senses. I debated yelling out, claiming to have a gun, but instead decided to be silent and retain the benefit of surprise. I heard footsteps circling my tent and was ready to slash at whatever opened it, but just like that, it was suddenly over. No more footsteps, no more whispering. I lay frozen awake in my tent until sunrise and opened it to find nobody there. The only evidence anything had actually happened were boot prints, the same as before. Several more days passed, and I was now in Shasta National Forest, probably 50 to 75 miles from where I first encountered that couple. The trail became more or less a goat trail. Being on the side of a mountain and above the tree line, I could see the trail winding for miles in front and behind me. I stopped for water in a rare moment of shade, and noticed 2 hikers miles behind me. All I could see were 2 white dots, moving slowly up the mountainside. Immediately, I said out loud, "Fuck this. This trip is over." I pulled out my map and looked for the nearest town, which appeared to be Castella, located just off of I-5. The only problem? It was 25 miles away. I hiked well into the night, trying to gain as much ground as possible. I kept losing the trail and decided to set up camp, this time far off the beaten path and into the forest. I got into my tent and tried to sleep, but every little noise kept me awake. After a few hours inside, I heard the telltale signs of another bad night. The footsteps, the whispering, the sticks breaking. Sound travels far in the absence of other sound. I knew they were close, but I couldn't tell just how close. All I could think was, this is fucked up. This is so fucked up, god damn it. Finally, a flashlight hit my tent, lighting up the entire thing for a moment, before it went dark. I unzipped my tent and climbed out carrying my knife, yelling nonsense out into the dark. It was sort of like that cliché scene in movies where people in the wilderness hear sticks breaking around them, and the camera pans around the trees because the people have no idea which direction they're coming from. I heard footsteps running toward the tent, and I barely made out a figure moving in my peripheral vision. I turned and ran deep into the forest. I tripped several times and ran into several trees. After running for approximately 5 minutes, I tripped, rolled, and came to rest next to a downed tree. I got underneath it and laid perfectly still. I could make out the flashlight waving around in the distance. I laid under that tree for hours. I was certain they were gone, but I still didn't move. Eventually, birds started chirping, and I knew sunrise would arrive soon. Once it did, I made my way back to the trail, abandoned my campsite, and walked the rest of the distance to Castella, where the Pacific Crest Trail crosses I-5. I hitchhiked my way to the town of Mount Shasta and spoke with the police and forestry service. They put me up in a motel for the night, and my parents drove from Oregon to pick me up the next day. I followed up with the police and forest service months later, who told me there had been similar reports of items disappearing from campsites all throughout the surrounding national forests. However, there had been no other reports of the terrorizing that I had experienced. As far as I know, nothing ever came of the couple.